December 2021 RPA that we've been hearing a lot about. Thought I'd mention them. Maybe they apply to you, maybe not. We'll see. And then it's just going to be a free-for-all, okay? We're going to open it up, and you can tell me what issues you're having, and maybe even you might want to say something that you actually like about it. That would be kind of a nice way to preface, before you start going into a tirade. So let's start off. Everybody has a copy in front of them. You have 2 extra pages there, just 2 single pages, and that's because in June we need to make a change to the RPA, matter of fact, to all of our purchase agreements. And there were so many things that people, like, from the moment the form comes out, everybody starts saying, well, you need to change this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, well, if we just went through like 8 months of training, let's not change too much in June, right? For anything that needs to be fixed, that'll happen in December. But what's happening in June is we are adding a paragraph, and you see it on one of your pages, and it's in the substantive appraisal contingency paragraph. So you'll see like red language at the bottom of one of those extra pages that you have there. Okay, one of them is called the Fair Appraisal Act Addendum. And then you'll see, I think it's maybe page 5, just page 5. I didn't want to give you the whole contract, right? Because everything's going to stay the same except for that language at the bottom that says, hey, there's this addendum that's being attached to the contract. Why is it being attached? Because the law says it has to be attached, okay? So the law doesn't even really say it that way, but we think an addendum makes it part of the contract. Whether in the future that the whole Fair Appraisal Act addendum gets put into the body of the RPA, we'll have to see how that works out. But it's there, it's going to be there starting in June because the law requires it to be there as of July 1st. But other than that, you're not going to see any differences in the RPA. So that's good. I did bring my little notepad today because we're still taking comments for people who think, ways that we can improve the contract. And our Standard Forms Committee is going to be looking at it over the next couple of months and probably making some changes, but hopefully nothing too significant. Okay, good. That's out of the way. Just go to the main contract that you have in front of you. Skip the agency disclosure. Skip the, fair housing addendum, or, skip all that beginning stuff and just go right to the purchase agreement. And so a comment that we've been getting a lot at CAR has to do with the appraisal contingency, right? And so I say just go to the grid, go to page 2 of 16 of the purchase agreement, and let's take a look at paragraph 3L2. And what do we find there? We find the appraisal contingency, right? So the contract has an appraisal contingency built into it. You look at the far right column, you want to write an offer without an appraisal contingency? No problem, check that box. There's no appraisal contingency, right? There's only 2 contingencies in the contract that can be removed in the body of the contract itself. That's the appraisal contingency and the loan contingency, right? Right above it, right? Or if you're making an all-cash offer, there will be no loan contingency. That's in the body of the all-cash language itself. So we start off, we have this appraisal contingency, right? Unless you opt out of it. We have this appraisal contingency. Doesn't matter if you're making an all-cash offer or you're making an offer with a loan. The appraisal contingency is an independent contingency. In that third column, see the bold appraisal, right? The appraisal contingency is based upon the appraised value at a minimum of the purchase price, or you can write something different in there. So let's start off with, what do contingencies do, right? What's the purpose of a contingency? The purpose of a contingency, in this case a buyer contingency, it gives a buyer a legal and contractual excuse to get out of the contract without any consequence. And the basic contingency language says, hey, if this property does not appraise at the full sales price during the contingency period, the buyer has a right to say, buy, I want out. Right? But what have we been hearing so much from the field, particularly the last few years? That appraisals are not keeping up with market value. And in that case, wow, that really is problematic, particularly for sellers, right, who are trying to maximize the amount that they sell their property for. If appraisals are not keeping up, then any buyer that has appraisal contingency is pretty much going to have a right to get out. And so that optional language, that checkbox in the dollar amount, gives a buyer an opportunity to say, you know what, even if the property does not appraise at the full sales price, as long as it appraises at this particular amount, essentially, I'm willing to go forward, or I do not have a legal excuse to cancel. Right? So let me just give you an example after I say one other thing. What does this clause not do? This clause just deals with the contingency. That's all it deals with. This clause does not address what happens if there's that differential. That's something that you have to consider and work with your clients about. Do you want to write something in to address it, or is it even necessary to write something in? So I'm so glad we've got a lender here today. So pay attention here, because I may be calling on you in just a second, right? Yeah, right, she's on her phone, and now she's looking up. Okay, good. Okay. So let's just give an example. I'm going to use a number because it's easy. Let's say you have $1 million purchase price. Okay. All right, great. So if we make no changes to that paragraph 3L2, what would the appraisal have to come in? $1 million, right? All right, but the values or the appraisals aren't keeping up a value. We're not really sure what it's going to come in at. So let's say you have a buyer who says, you know what, as long as it comes in at $900,000, I'm willing to purchase for $1 million. Okay, fine. So you check that box, you write in $900,000, even though the purchase price is $1 million. Okay. Do you have to do anything else? Well, it depends. Okay. Let's say your buyer is making an all-cash offer. Well, there's nothing else that needs to be done. As long as the appraisal comes in at $900,000, the buyer does not have a legal excuse to cancel, and the buyer will have to pay the $1 million. Okay. What if you have a buyer who understands we've got an incredibly competitive market and is putting a lot of money down, right, to strengthen their offer? So again, in my fictional world, I'm going to say the buyer is putting $500,000 down. They want to get a loan for whatever reason, right? So they're going to get a loan for $500,000. So the appraisal comes in at $900,000. Buyer still has to pay $1 million. Okay? So the issue is a lender still going to loan $500,000? The buyer was going to put down $500 and get a loan for $500. So let me ask our host, okay? You've got a $900,000 appraisal. The buyer is putting $500,000 down. Is it likely that the lender is still going to loan $500,000? It won't change your term. Right. So in that situation, there's nothing else that needed to be done. You're just going to make the offer that way. The seller should understand that. But now we're going to change it up. We're going to say a buyer is coming in, the buyer only has 20% down. All right, so the buyer's going to get an 80% loan. So the buyer needs a loan of $800,000. And maybe the buyer does the good thing, the smart thing. And I was so glad to hear the sponsor today talk about this, which is get a fully underwritten pre-approval, right, before making the offer, because that really is helping the buyer strengthen their position and compete with others in the marketplace. And let's say the appraisal comes in at $900,000. Still, the purchase price is $1 million. Okay. Question is is the lender going to loan $800,000 with a $900,000 appraisal? Now, if the lender sticks with 80% of value, that's only $720,000. The buyer was going to put $200,000 down, right? So there's an $80,000 shortfall. How is that $80,000 shortfall going to be made up in the situation where there's an 80% loan, right? And that $100,000 difference between the purchase price and the loan amount. All right, so you got to ask yourself that question, what's going to do? So in that type of situation, so let me ask you, would the lender make an $800,000 loan on a $900,000 purchase price?
Yeah, that's an 88% LTV, so you would just have to, it would change the rate and term, but you would still get financing.
Okay, so it's still possible.
A little bit of wiggle room.
Little bit of wiggle room. All right, but you'd have to change the rate and the terms, right? Okay, so on the previous page of the purchase agreement, you're setting out the rates, right? You're setting out the terms. So maybe the loan won't be able to fit into what was set into the purchase agreement. And so in that situation, where the buyer recognized the reality of rising values and appraisals not keeping up with the values, right? Something needs to be done. And so the buyer, just a moment, the buyer needs to be talking with the buyer's lender to figure out what needs to be done in that situation, right? Because now you're going to get that situation, the buyer says, well, will I still be able to purchase under those different rates and terms that the lender will be offering for a $900,000 appraisal? Or will the buyer have to come up with the differential in cash, right? So when you're in that situation and you're working with the buyer, you need to have that discussion with your buyer and say, buyer, you need to talk to your lender. I'm happy to be there with you, but you need to talk to your lender to figure out what happens if the appraisal does not come in at the full purchase price, right? And you've got to remember that 3L2 does not do any of that for you. All 3L2 says is, unless the appraisal comes in at the price that we're specifying here, okay, or if it does not come in at the price we're specifying here, buyer during this appraisal contingency period, however long you're going to have it, right? The default is 17 days. I understand those are being shortened all over the state, all right? So whatever the period is, I don't care if it's 2 days or 10 days or 17 days, all right? All this clause does is say, buyer, you have the right to get out if the appraisal value does not meet what you put into that third column in 3L2. It does not address those other issues. Those other issues need to be talked about. Maybe the buyer has plenty of money and the buyer will write into the offer, for example, in paragraph 3R, the other terms paragraph, buyer will make up the differential in cash. Maybe that's what you say, okay? But you just got to understand the way the contract works, okay? So that's something that is probably the most talked about issue that we are hearing at the Seattle Legal Hotline statewide. I know you had your hand up, but just give me a chance just to go through just 2 more issues, and then, like I said, then we're just going to open up for questions for the rest of the hour. Okay. So, we're here in Santa Barbara, but not every property is located in Santa Barbara property, right? You have this big area here. And so I'm going to ask you a question before I even go into the second potential issue. Do you see FHA transactions anywhere in your marketplace? For the most part, you're saying no, so I'm not going to talk about something for the 1 or 2 of you that deals with that issue. Okay, great. So the next issue I want to talk about then is...
We do.
FHA in Santa Barbara County, we just
Right.
don't see it in the
Yeah, right, I understand that, right. But I'm trying to find out if that's a big enough issue to enough of you here for me to discuss it right now. And because I'm hearing so many no's, if I get an individual question, I'll address it, okay? So let's just go on, because well, great. The third thing that was on my list was paragraph 3H3, which we already discussed, right? So that was the pre-approval, right? So a pre-qual, pre-approval, and we added that box for fully underwritten pre-approval. And anybody who's working with a buyer wants to have their buyer talk to the lender and see, can we get that? Right? So your sponsor today, what's your name again?
Kelly.
No, the name of your company.
Cornerstone.
Cornerstone offers that, right? Not every company offers it, but that's certainly a valuable tool for anybody who's working with a buyer. So you want to see if your buyer can get that. Flip the page. Go to paragraph 3P, which is this list where you can check off all these things that are going to come with the property. And some of those things might apply anyway, but in order to avoid disputes, you check the box. Now there's no issue about whether this item is coming with the property. Right? My favorite two things on this list are wine refrigerators, right, and electric car charging stations. Right? Right? Things that you probably don't see a lot of in North Dakota and Montana. Okay? So you make it clear, right? But the reason I'm bringing this paragraph up to you today is because notice there's one box here that's pre-checked and it's bathroom mirrors. Right? So it doesn't matter if the mirror is bolted to the wall, if it's glued to the wall, or if it's hanging. The bathroom mirrors are included. Okay. You got a seller who wants to take that bathroom mirror with them because they're just so comfortable every morning brushing their teeth, looking in that mirror, and they want it in their new house? Great. Then that seller's going to have to counter it out. Okay? Because the default position, the only one that's pre-checked is bathroom mirrors, and it does not have to be permanently affixed to the wall to be included. Any bathroom mirrors are included. Okay, next issue. I don't even know where the next issue is. I should know that. You'd think I would know that. It's actually on the previous page. It's 3M3. Tenant-occupied property. And it's kind of a problem, and it was kind of a problem before, and it's still a little bit of a problem, but I can tell you we're going to be working on that. That's one of the things that's going to be adjusted in December. Okay? So what did the contract say before? It said all properties, tenant-occupied, seller-occupied, vacant, didn't matter, had to be delivered vacant on the close of escrow. And of course, what do we realize in California? It is impossible to remove a tenant. Or practically impossible to remove a tenant. Okay? And you know what? That was true even before all the COVID rules. And it was creating a problem because sellers could not deliver by default a vacant property if it was tenant occupied. And so he said, okay, if there's tenant occupied property, you just need to add this addendum, the TOPA, tenant occupied property addendum. And the TOPA form takes the default position, the tenant is going to stay. So a complete reversal from the old contract. The default is that the tenant is going to stay under that TOPA form. Now you can still check a box in that other form and say tenant is going to be removed. But our forms committee said we have to recognize the reality in California that that is extremely difficult to accomplish. And so even if that other box is checked, if the seller is making a good faith effort to remove the tenant and cannot do it, hold on. The buyer has two choices. Either go ahead and keep the tenant there or cancel and get your money back. Okay? Now, how does one show if the seller is actually making a good faith effort to remove the tenant? Good faith is always a question of fact. But listen, if the seller has given notice, if the seller has hired an attorney, if the seller has started the eviction process, you can pretty much say that seller is acting in good faith. If a seller has not done a single thing to try to remove the then I think you've got a very good argument that seller has not acted in good faith. Okay? So the two important issues here for tenant-occupied property is, one, the contract itself does not address it. You need to use the addendum. The addendum defaults to the tenant staying. If you check the box, the tenants can be removed. We recognize that may not be possible, and the buyer's remedies are going to be limited. We did not want to have the situation, as we did under the old version of the contract, where where sellers were constantly being in default because they could not get rid of a tenant on time. Okay, next issue. I'll stick to the same page because it's kind of sort of in a way addressed on this page. And it's also 3L. And if we look at 3L 4, 5, 6, 7, it establishes the contingency period as 17 days, that's the default. Or it says, or 5 days after receipt of those documents. Right? So that is establishing how long the contingency period is going to last. Okay. General rule, when does seller have to provide everything? The general rule under paragraph 14, seller, you have to provide everything within 7 days. That's the seller's general time frame to provide documents to a buyer. Okay. So if the seller gives things in time, and I'm just going to use our defaults for the time being, if the seller gives everything on time, within 7 days, and the buyer has a 17-day contingency period, the buyer should have, 10 days to review the documents and decide whether to proceed or not. Okay. But what if the seller does not provide the documents until day 15? Should the buyer's contingency period really end in 2 days? Right? So it's going to be whichever gives the buyer the longer period of time. So the seller provides the documents on day 15, you're going to have 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. The contingency period is really going to go to day 20 for those items. Okay. Let's say the seller gives the documents on day 10 instead of day 7. Is it 5 days after receipt? No, it's going to be whatever's longer, right? 5 days after receipt would mean the contingency would end on day 15. But the default time is day 17. So it's not going to reduce the buyer's time. It can only be used to increase the buyer's time. And again, if you're changing the defaults, that's fine. I just want to make sure you understand how the process works for those particular items. And my last comment is this. We are finding there's a lot of confusion, and I think it's because this has a 5-day period of time, about the distinction, or what some people think is a lack of distinction, between an investigation contingency and a cancellation right after receiving a TDS or a seller property questionnaire. Those are two completely independent rights. Okay? So again, the contingency period, a buyer investigation contingency period, 17 days. Once that period comes and goes, whether the buyer removes it or whether the seller gives a notice to perform, doesn't matter. Once it's gone, it's gone. But the statutory cancellation right that the buyer has after receiving a TDS or SPQ, the seller property questionnaire, okay, exists independently. And it's really a 5-day right because it's 5 days if whether you mail it or send it via email. And so those are completely independent rights. So the contingency could go away. But if the seller's TDS comes later, and the seller's TDS means Section 1 is completed, Section 2 is completed, right? And then the seller side broker, the listing broker section is completed. Once all of those 3 things have been completed and been delivered to the buyer, that's what triggers the 5-day rescission right. And the only way to avoid that is to have all those three things given to the buyer before the contract is entered into. Okay? But the contingency and the statutory cancellation rights are independent items. Okay, that's good for my opening remarks. There was 2 people who got their hands up real early, so we're going to go 1, and then somewhere over there 2, and then I see you way in the back 3. But let's start with 1 and 2. Start with you right here.
Okay, when we started, you made the example about the appraisal that came in low. Instead of $1 million, came in at $900,000. Yes, we all agreed that the loan can still be made because the loan amount can go as high as what is deeded up to 90%. The only comment I would make to that, even though you can do it with a loan, and the loan to value still fits lending guidelines, you still want to check with your lender right away to make sure that the change in terms, which many times will be perhaps a higher interest rate, that will not disqualify your clients.
Absolutely. Absolutely, which is why I recommend you always talk to the lender about that, because you're right. Because a loan contingency, which is different from the appraisal contingency, they're 2 independent contingencies. The loan contingency in the CR contract is essentially a 2-pronged contingency. The loan contingency says the property will qualify and the buyer will qualify. So even if the property qualifies for the loan, maybe on different terms, right, the buyer may not qualify, right, because of those different terms. So good issue, good point to understand the distinction between an appraisal contingency and a loan contingency, and although they're distinct, they are related and they impact one another. I see some other hands, but I want to get to the 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to kind of open it up and we'll see what happens from there.
So my question has to do with the tenant-occupied units.
Okay.
Just the change that happened there. I know in 2020, mid-year, one of the houses that was on my block, the owners served them notice saying we're moving back into the house and the tenants had to vacate by a specific date. I don't know if if that's been changed or if the rules regarding that's been changed, but how would that affect in this tenant occupied? Like, could you still give them notice saying that it will be owner occupied, or does that make any difference whatsoever now?
Okay. So the issue depends on what and when.
Okay.
Or I should say who and when. Who and when, okay? So under COVID rules, there are very limited rights to remove a tenant, okay? Those have basically gone away, but we go back to something that started in January of 2020 and has almost been forgotten about, okay? And something like the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, I think, which establishes statewide rent control and eviction control throughout all of California. Okay? Under that, certain properties are exempt from those rules. So for example, single-family residential properties are exempt from those rules, provided you do not have a corporate owner. Okay? All right? But what does that affect? That affects the seller, the owner at that time. Now, maybe you have a month-to-month tenancy. The buyer is taking with the tenant in possession. The buyer says, guess what? Now I'm the owner. I'm not a corporate entity. I want to regain possession because the property is exempt from the eviction control restrictions. That would be a buyer's right, but that is independent of the contract. That's not the seller's responsibility for the buyer to exercise their right. Okay? All right, in the back, somebody in the back.
3L, 4, 5, and 6. Can you overwrite the 5-day after receipt and make it shorter if you're writing a really quick contract and you don't have these things up front?
Okay, great. Good question, right? So you see, the question is, can in 3L, 4, 5, 6, 7, can you change that 5-day period of time, I'm assuming to something less. Somebody would probably want to make it to something less than 5 days. Notice there is no option there to change it, right? The default time frames can all be changed. You can change 17 to 10 or 5 or 2 or 1 or whatever you want, but there's no pre-printed ability to change that 5-day time frame. Can it be done? Yes, language is going to have to be drafted. You would put that language into paragraph 3R, other terms and conditions. But we don't make it easy for you, okay? Why do we not make it easy for you? Because just a basic sense of fairness to a buyer that they should be given a certain amount of time to review documents that are being sent to them. And documents are huge, right? To say, okay, buyer, you've got 1 day after delivery. Oh my goodness, right? So the Standard Forms Committee has made a judgment call that 5 days is a reasonable amount of time. If that judgment call does not work for your individual transaction, then individualized language is going to have to be drafted. We're not going to help you with that language. Okay?
And related, for some reason I can't put zeros in anymore, even with a space bar.
Right.
Nowadays. So what do we do about that?
The contract is purposely designed so you cannot put zeros there, okay, for those default periods. If you want to write an offer without contingencies, easy to do. Look at paragraph 3L, the far right column. You want to write a non-contingent offer or have certain contingencies removed, attach the contingency removal form with the offer. That is the way to do it. There was a real problem with zeros. There was a problem in the old contract, and the problem continues to exist with the new contract, which is if you put in a 0, what does that mean? There's 0 days to remove the contingency. What if the contingency is not removed? What happens? Seller has to issue a notice to perform. So the seller would have to immediately issue a notice to perform. What does a notice to perform do? Give somebody 2 days. So if you write in 0, you are effectively, contractually, always giving the buyer 2 days to remove the contingency. Or the buyer is writing in at least 2 days because maybe the seller's agent is not smart enough to figure out that they need to immediately issue a notice to perform. Right? So 0 does not help. 0 does not accomplish what most people want to accomplish, which is writing an offer without that particular contingency. Okay? The only 2 contingencies that can be removed in the body of the purchase agreement are loan and appraisal. Anything else, you need to use the contingency removal form that needs to be attached to the offer. Okay, next, all the way in the back, and then I'll come up to the lady in the white skirt, off-white skirt.
That appraisal coming in below the purchase value, in respect to 3E1, where you're putting on the contract the interest rate that is going to be charged on this loan, and as Kelly said, if this, came up, you would have.
Okay, I need to speak up a little bit, please. You're all the way in the back. I could barely hear you.
Well,
Can
I'm
you?
just wondering if the interest rate is changed as a result of a low appraisal value, and they have to find a new loan, does that mean that we have to put an amendment to the contract to reflect that?
If I were the seller, I would want to have that addressed. Okay? If I'm the buyer, I may not want to address that, right? If I'm the buyer, if I want to show the seller, hey, I'm able to come up with the cash for that differential, I'm probably going to write that into the offer because that's going to make the seller feel comfortable, right? If you have a smart seller, somebody who's been to a seminar like today, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, we've got a low down payment borrower who is writing an offer with a appraisal contingency at less than the purchase price. I know that that may trigger a change in terms, which may give the buyer a right to get out of the contract under the loan contingency paragraph, right? So I may want to have that addressed, right? If I see that type of offer coming in, right? Can it be addressed at a later point in time? Sure, if you think you can get parties to agree when they're in a dispute. Okay? So it's better to be thinking about that up front. right? So that's another good point about paragraph 3L2. It does not address those issues. It just addresses the buyer's ability to cancel the contract if the appraisal does not come in at the specified price. Okay? So yes, it's good, you know, and then do I have magic language for a situation like that? No, honestly, I don't. But I'm glad you raised the issue, because the issue of, do you put in an interest rate into paragraph 3E1 or 2 if there's going to be a junior loan? Okay. And the answer at CAR is always, you should. It's there to protect both the buyer and the seller. Okay? How does it protect the buyer? It protects the buyer by establishing the outside parameter of the kind of loan that the buyer needs to get. And if the buyer can't get that loan, the buyer will have a legal and contractual excuse to cancel. How does it protect the seller, right? Because a lot of people write offers and leave that blank. Right? I know people used to try to write in when they could, you know, market rates or something ambiguous and ridiculous like that. Okay? But that doesn't tell you anything. What that tells you is, we're going to let a judge decide 3 years from now who was right and who was wrong. Okay? So I'm a seller. I see an offer come in without the interest rate on the loan filled in. I should be thinking one of two things. Okay? Somebody was just negligent, you know, sloppy on the buyer's side and wrote the offer and didn't fill it in, didn't think about what was going on. Or they're trying to get away with something. Right? You know what? It didn't matter too much, really, for 2, 3, 4 year period of time. Because interest rates weren't fluctuating. Or if they did fluctuate, they were going down. So who cared? But it really matters now. And now, if I'm a seller, and that field comes in and it's left blank, okay, I have to ask myself, is this a serious buyer? Does this buyer understand that rates are increasing? Right? Or if a buyer comes in and writes in 3%, I'm thinking this buyer is living in 2019. Okay, right. Nostalgic, that's that buyer, right? So I want to counter back with something realistic, right? I don't have to necessarily counter back with 10%, but maybe I'm going to counter back with 5.5, maybe 6, depending on what's going on, what the week is, what the Fed's doing that week, whatever, right? Because then I can say, buyer, now I'm putting you in a position to say, you need to talk to your lender and find out if that's realistic. And if it's not realistic, don't accept the counter. Goodbye. And I probably have other people to choose from anyway. Okay. All right. There was a woman back here. Did you have your hand up? I'm sorry. I'll let her hand up. Go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment about that, because you're right. If even if they're fully approved, you need to make sure they're looking at the current rates, because they have changed so rapidly, it can lower their maximum purchase price. And so we are constantly going through that, and we are seeing people decreasing in their borrowing power. So that's a really important box. It always has been, but more than ever now.
Okay. Thank you. Nice to get positive reinforcement. Go.
Going to the statutory disclosures, the TDS.
Okay.
So you're saying you get that up front before the offer, and it has the listing agent's AVID attached to it, so it's complete. So the selling agent's AVID is out of the equation of being a response time frame as a way to get out of a contract, if you will, if they say something.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. So for the TDS to trigger a buyer's right to rescind, it's really a right to cancel, but let's say a right to rescind. Okay. The triggering events are the seller has completed sections 1 and 2, and the seller's agent has completed section 3. Okay. The buyer's agent portion has no effect whatsoever on the buyer's ability to cancel.
Unless
The comment is, well, what if the buyer's agent finds something that makes the seller think, oh, I forgot to mention that? Okay? Just slipped my mind about the fire, in the attic. I forgot all about that. Okay. It is not the buyer's agent's disclosure that triggers any cancellation right. Not at all. If the seller then makes a subsequent disclosure, that's what triggers the right, but not the buyer's agent's disclosure. And this is something CAR wanted to clarify for 30 years, right? The TDS has been around for 30 years. And it was ambiguous up until about, I think like 5 years ago, we finally got it clarified. And we always said to ourselves, it makes no sense to trigger a buyer's cancellation right to the buyer's agent's disclosure, because then the buyer's agent will just wait until the day before close of escrow to do a disclosure. So that makes no sense at all. That defeats the purpose of the statute, which is to get information early in the transaction rather than late in the transaction. Finally, we got the statute clarified. So now the buyer's agent still has to make a disclosure. Their duty is under what's called 2079 of the Civil Code. They can fulfill that duty by using the TDS, or they can fulfill it separately by using their own AVID and their own disclosure. Okay? All right up front.
Back to the TDS and the SBQ. If you represent the seller, and the seller, as part of a counter, sends the TDS and the SBQ, and the buyer signs it, is that a done deal? Does that end the 5 days, or have they said, okay, we're good with this? Does that put an end to it?
Right, so that's a good issue, because I said if the TDS or SBQ are given before the offer has been made, then there is no cancellation right, okay? The buyer presumably had that information before the buyer made an offer. What if the seller attaches those documents, and assuming they're complete, both seller sections completed and the listing agent completed, and the seller attaches those to a counteroffer? Would that have the same effect? I believe the answer to that is yes, because the buyer then has the option. I could review the TDS and the SBQ before deciding whether to accept the counteroffer. No contract has been created prior to the acceptance of the counteroffer. So I think there would be no 5-day rescission right if those documents are attached to a counteroffer that the seller makes and gives to the buyer.
And a further element to that question, if you put the TDS and the SBQ in the MLS as documents, does that count as information given to a potential buyer?
I would say no. I would say no. Okay, you need to have information that the buyer has received them. Posting them in the MLS does not mean the buyer has received them, right? So what we always want to get, of course, is a buyer signature. But if you're attaching it to a counteroffer, and it's clear that they're being attached to the counteroffer and they're being incorporated into the counteroffer, then the buyer's signature on the counteroffer is a recognition that they have seen those two documents, whether they looked at them or not.
Got it.
Okay,
Thank you.
right up there.
So on the FAAA, is this going to be bundled with the RPA since it's incorporated in page 5 of 16?
Right, so starting in July,
It'll be,
the FAAA will automatically bundled, right? So you've got all those forms up front, right? I imagine it's frustrating for your clients, right? Oh, I'm sending you the purchase agreement, and they're looking like, yeah, where's the purchase agreement? Okay, I'll flip over this page, I'll go to the next 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 page, oh, here it is, right? So now there'll be one more page.
okay, next question. In February, the state came out with the DEDA, because obviously there was issues on page 16 with automated electronic delivery address. Is that still under review, and will that continue to possibly change?
Okay, so let's go to the contract. The question has to do with a addendum that Sierra created in February. And the addendum was trying to address electronic delivery of documents. So on the last page of the purchase agreement, page 16, that's where the agent signed. You got that real estate broker box. In paragraph 5, you've got the signatures for the seller side and the buyer side agent. I've reversed the order. And then in each section it says designated electronic delivery address. And you could put an email there, you can put a text number there, you can put some alternate number there, right? What's the purpose of that clause? The purpose of that clause is to establish that a document has been delivered. Okay? So in paragraph 25, which is a couple of pages earlier, in paragraph 25K on page 13, we have a definition of delivery. And delivery is effective upon personal receipt. And personal receipt is made when the principal, the buyer or seller, actually receives a document, or their authorized agent, who's an individual salesperson or broker associate. Could be an individual broker too, for sole brokerages. Okay? So delivery is effective when the principal or their agent are actually in personal receipt of a document. Same rule as under the old contract. That sometimes created problems. Remember in the old contract, at the bottom of the last page, there was a confirmation, basically, of receipt, right? And that applied to other documents as well. And I think on a good day, maybe that confirmation was filled out half the time. Okay, and that's a good day. So how did you prove it? Well, you had to prove it some other way. The person admitted, I received it. The person sent you a text back. Thanks for sending me the offer. Thanks for sending me the notice to perform. Or, some other thought about sending you with what they sent you, what they were sent. Okay? So that was one way to prove it. The issue was, under the law, what if you sent something electronically? Is that proof of personal receipt? And there was no real answer under the law, and there was no real answer under the contract. So paragraph 25K was written that said, if that section on page 16 is filled out, if somebody puts in an email or a text number under the designated electronic delivery address, then as soon as a document is sent to that address, it is deemed to be received. Okay? Boom, you just have to hit send. You hit send, that's it. You've done all you need to do. You don't have to call up the other side, did you get it? Send me back a signed receipt, this and that. You hit send. They're the ones who put down the designated number, and it makes the transaction so much easier. Now, that may wind up being the result in the law anyway, but the law has not caught up with technology. So our form had to address the technology issue. So in February, the Sierra Standard Forms Committee said, we are recognizing that there's a lot of people out in the field who don't realize that designated electronic delivery address section is there on page 16, or they don't know what to do about it. And so we created an addendum, amendment, I think we call it, designated electronic delivery address amendment, I think is what it's called, DEDA, to give people a chance to say, okay, we're in contract, but let's make it easy on ourselves and let's use designated electronic addresses, because face it, nobody hands things to anybody else. Everybody transacts business electronically. That's the reality, right? And so if the DEDA was left blank in the purchase agreement, there's a way to address that afterwards by mutual agreement. Okay? Now, having that section completed does impose a burden on the side that is completing it. Okay? You need to be checking your email. You need to be checking your text. You need to understand how to get into your spam filter. Right? You need to be able to figure that stuff out. Right? I mean, at CAR, I feel like I work for NASA. We have such a stringent program. I belong to a group. I'm a volunteer for something called the California Lawyers Association. Every message I get from the California Lawyers Association, mentioned in my bio, I was chairperson of the real property section. Every message I get from them goes straight into spam. I have requested 3 times that they be released. I still cannot get them into my inbox. Okay? So what do I know? I know I better be checking my spam filter if I'm expecting something from this group that I belong to and that I used to chair. I better be checking that. Right? You're in a transaction, you're the agent. It's usually the agent's text number, the agent's email address that is written down there. You're in a transaction, you better be checking. You better expect you're going to be getting documents during the transaction. Right? So that is the burden that is imposed upon you. Is our Standard Forms Committee going to be looking at that? Yes, we're going to be looking at that. In the prior contract, we had this addendum that could be used that said, if you're going to do something electronically, you need to send it to 2 different addresses. That was not the methodology that the Standard Forms Committee chose for the new purchase agreement. Might they reconsider that? They might. I have no idea what conclusion they'll come to. We're going to kind of have to see how this is playing out in the field. That's why I did not really want to make changes to the purchase agreement in June. Let's give it some time to see what's happening in the field. Let's see if something's working or if something's not working. If it's not working, we'll fix it. If it is working, why mess it up?